Good afternoon. I have to say from the outset, like, Shanaz is going to do that the whole time. You all are very committed to democracy because this is the first time we've seen sun in about 40 days, but yet you're here with us this afternoon, and we appreciate it, and it's going to be a great conversation with these two gentlemen. So it's my honor to introduce them, and I will not editorialize, I will just read introductions. Eboo Patel is a civic leader who believes that religious diversity is an essential and inspiring dimension of American democracy. Eboo is the founder and president of Interfaith America, formerly known as the Interfaith Youth Corps, where I had happened to work for almost 10 years, helping to build the organization earlier in my career. And it's the leading interfaith organization in the United States. Under his leadership, Interfaith America has worked with governments, universities, private companies, and civic organizations to make faith a bridge of cooperation rather than a barrier of division. Eboo served on President Obama's inaugural Faith Council, and he's given hundreds of keynote addresses. I might have listened to hundreds of them when I worked with you, and has written 5 books, including We Need to Build, Field Notes for Diverse Democracy. And I'll say from the outset, what I love about this book is that you really go step by step on how you built the organization of Interfaith America. So for anybody who wants to build an organization, like, it's a must-have book. He's an Ashoka Fellow. He holds a doctorate in sociology from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. He lives in Chicago, and probably the most important thing about him, he lives in Chicago with his wife Shanaz and their 2 sons, who are here today, Zayd and Khalil. Well, a special welcome to you two. Yeah, you do deserve applause. And I'd like to introduce Yascha Mounk. Yascha is a writer, academic, and public speaker known for his work on the crisis of democracy and the defense of philosophically liberal values. Born in Germany to Polish parents, Yascha received his BA in history from Trinity College, Cambridge, and his PhD in government from Harvard University. He's an associate professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins, where he holds appointments in both the School of Advanced and International Studies and the NSF Agora Institute. Yascha is also contributing editor at The Atlantic, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and the founder of, I'm thinking of it as an e-zine, an e-magazine, Persuasion, which is a very lively website, and everybody should check it out. And of course, Yascha has also authored this book, The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. So I think we can read dozens of books around, what's on the depressing state of affairs of democracy and, what are the ways in which we are failing. But I'm happy to tell you that's not what this conversation is going to be. This is going to be a conversation driven by hope, and we have these 2 gentlemen here. One comes from the point of view as a political theorist, and the other really as an organizer. And both of them have written books that are both inspirational and aspirational, which I think is difficult when we're talking about, a topic as complex as diverse democracies. So Yascha, you write, never in history has a democracy succeeded in being both diverse and equal, treating members of many different ethnic or religious groups fairly. And yet, achieving that goal is now central to the democratic project in countries around the world. Yet Freedom House finds that the world has entered the 16th consecutive year of what the political scientist Larry Diamond calls a democratic recession. And according to a recent Axios poll here in America, only a slim majority, about 55% of Americans, accept that Joe Biden legitimately won the 2020 election. So I'd love you to start and tell us, why has democracy become so fragile here in the US and around the world? And are we at a turning point? And if so, can you kind of outline that?
Small question. I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation. And isn't it nice to be in person together in a room again after the pandemic? It's so lovely. So let me split the question in half. We've seen the rise of authoritarian populism around the world for a number of years now. I made my name in many ways as a grad student who was taught by my wonderful professors that democracy is fragile in many parts of the world. It's fragile in poor countries, and it's fragile in countries that don't have a long democratic tradition. But in places like Germany, where I grew up, in places like the United States, in places like Australia and Japan, we really don't have to worry about the future of democracy. because these countries have had a number of changes of government for free and fair elections. They're relatively affluent, and so we can just fast forward history, and we know they're always going to be democracies. And I started worrying about whether that was really true, because I saw all of these signs of democratic brittleness. I saw fading political participation, people giving less importance to living in a democracy, being more open to authoritarian alternatives, the extremes rising, and this new crop of authoritarian populists winning power in so many different parts of the world. And so that is what we've seen with Donald Trump in the United States, with Narendra Modi in India, with Recep Erdogan in Turkey, with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and so many other leaders around the world. And I think this has sort of these structural reasons. It has to do with the stagnation of living standards for average citizens in many countries. It has to do with the rise of the internet and social media and the ways in which it pulls our politics to the extreme. But I do also think that it has to do with the topic of my new book, of A Great Experiment, which is that we are actually trying to do something unprecedented right now. So, again, a country like Germany, where I grew up, was very homogeneous at the moment of the founding of its successful democracy. Because of the tragedies and the crimes of the first half of the 20th century, by the late 1940s, when the Federal Republic was established, Germany was pretty religiously and ethnically homogeneous. A country like the United States has, of course, always been deeply diverse, but it has become more diverse, and most importantly, it didn't used to treat its members as equals. It, quote unquote, dealt with the problem of diversity by saying this one group gets the power and the influence and so on, and the other groups are excluded, sometimes in soft ways, sometimes in the most extreme and violent ways like chattel slavery. And so what we're doing right now is really unprecedented, to try and build these deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies that actually treat their members in a fair way and as equals. And in the book, I try to explain that people tend to be naive about how easy that should be. They tend to say, well, it's not hard to have tolerance for each other. It's not hard to be friendly towards your neighbor. And that then leads them into a deep pessimism. Because then we look at the state of our society and say, my God, why is everything going wrong? There must be something uniquely wrong with all of us as a society. How can we have hope for the future? What I try to do in this book is to set out why building diverse societies and diverse democracies is really hard, why it's gone badly wrong in so many times and places in human history, and why actually, once you understand that, you can look back at the United States and you can look back at the changes over the last decades and have some hard-won optimism that, not perhaps at a political level, not in terms of what's going on in Congress or what you see on cable news, but in terms of the changes in the heart of our society, we are actually making real progress towards building these diverse democracies, and we can continue to build on that in the coming decades.
Eboo, what does it mean to build a diverse democracy?
Yeah, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be here. So Z and I have been friends for 15 years. She's been friends with my wife for 25, but this is like a reunion of sorts. And Yascha and I just went to the best casual restaurant in Chicago, my favorite spot, and I introduced Yascha to the green chili enchiladas Christmas style. So
Eboo and I have been friends for 3 hours, but I think we know we're going to be friends for 30 years.
That's right. So listen, I loved Yascha's book. Right, I loved the book, and I think as I read it, I thought to myself, boy, is Yascha smart, and boy, I feel like I wrote the other side of the coin of Yascha's book, right? So Yascha's book is a lot about the political workings of a diverse democracy and how complex and important those are. So he's got this beautiful chapter on philosophical liberalism versus communitarianism, a variety of policies we can pass to strengthen diverse democracy, et cetera. Super important. I talk about, in my book, the other side of that, which is how do you build the civil society of a diverse democracy, right? And I actually think that it doesn't replace voting rights. It doesn't replace separation of powers. It doesn't, obviously, right? It doesn't replace fears around authoritarianism, but it's the place where most of us spend most of our time outside of families, right? We spend our time in volunteer activities. We spend our time in athletic leagues. We spend our time in church, synagogue, mosque. It's the place where people from diverse identities and divergent ideologies come together to engage in common aims and cooperative relationships. I know that that's a triple mouthful, but I'm going to say it again, right? That I think this is the real genius of this is a requirement of a diverse democracy, and it is the real genius of American society. is you have a critical mass of institutions and spaces. A YMCA is a perfect example of this. A food bank is a perfect example of this, that brings people from diverse identities and divergent ideologies together for common aims, and the nature of the activity shapes cooperative relationships. When Baha'is and Buddhists and evangelicals and atheists walk into a food bank, they're there for a common aim, and the activity shapes the relationship. And it's the same when my kids are going to their basketball practices at night, right? Diverse identities, divergent ideologies, common aim, cooperative relationships. I want to say that in so many ways, I think like the greatest inspiration for our time, the geographical space of it is 2 blocks from here. It's where Jane Addams founded Hull House, okay? And the late 19th, early 20th century feels a lot like today. Massive structural transition, agrarian to urban, not only in terms of space, but also in terms of economy, right? An agrarian economy to an industrial economy. Super ugly things happening in cities. Massive income inequality. Enormously ugly racist movements. And here comes this woman, born in Rockford, Illinois, comes to Chicago and sets up shop right here on Halstead Street and just starts solving concrete problems. There's 7,000 children in the immediate area. There are only 3,000 seats in schools. She starts building classrooms. There's really terrible sanitation problems that are leading to all kinds of like deadly diseases. 3 bathtubs in the whole ward. She builds public baths, right? And it's not just local solutions for local problems. It gives rise to a whole set of reform movements. So the first truancy officer operates out of Hull House. But the idea of a truancy officer then becomes part of public policy and public schools. So I think a huge part of what we can do in the United States, a huge part of what makes our society healthy and vibrant, is people standing up and saying, I'll solve that, right? And it's a local solution to a local problem that has massive national implications. I'll say just one more thing. One of the reasons that we at Interfaith America always took such inspiration from Jane Addams is because she did her stuff by directly engaging the diverse religious identities of the day, right? So it was a time of ugly anti-Catholicism, a time of ugly anti-Semitism, and she decides Hull House is going to be a very intentional interfaith space. She builds public kitchens where she says people are going to bring recipes from their ethnic and religious heritages. We're going to cook together. We're going to share recipes. We're going to create, in a way, an American cuisine. She calls it the fellowship of the deed. Bring people together around the fellowship of the deed, right? And that was, in huge part, kind of an inspiration for us at Interfaith Youth Corps, now Interfaith America. What are the deeds, the concrete activities where you can bring diverse people with divergent ideologies around common aims that shape cooperative relationships?
Thank you, Eboo. So we've kind of talked about the necessity of engaging diversity in order to achieve the benefits for democracy, and that maybe civil society in this country is unique because from our earliest times we've had associations, volunteer organizations, houses of worship, faith-based institutions. I wonder, and Yascha, we could start with you, like this idea of social capital, if you can define it, and not assume that our audience knows what that means and why it pays dividends to democracy. And then I think a step beyond that, what is the difference between bonding and bridging capital? You have a great example in the book about the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh after the Ahodhya Mosque pogrom, or the Babri Masjid, pogrom. And you talk about these 2 towns that had really different impacts on the Hindu-Muslim riots that followed in Aligarh and Karid Code. It's a mouthful. So can you kind of talk about that idea of social capital and how we build it?
Yeah, great. Let me take even one step further back, because one of the fundamental facts about human nature, wherever we are, is a form of groupishness. And I tell the story in the book of Henry Teifel, who's a really influential social psychologist in the second half of the 20th century. Now, most of his family is killed in the Holocaust, and he's a young man, and he tries to understand what is it that makes groups tick? What is it that can make members of one group be willing to kill members of other groups in the most extreme ways, as you've seen throughout history, not just in the Holocaust, but in the Rwandan genocide and so many other places. And he says, hey, I have an idea. I'm going to create groups that are so silly and pointless that the members are not going to discriminate against each other, and then I'll slowly add features to those groups until they start discriminating against each other, and that'll teach me something about what makes groups tick and what makes them potentially dangerous, right? And so he gets a bunch of kids from the suburbs of Bristol, where he's a professor at the time in England, and he shows them a big sheet of paper with a bunch of dots on it, randomly distributed. And he asks them to estimate how many dots are on the sheet of paper. And so there's about 150 dots, and some say 130 or 120, and some say 170 or 180. He says, great, I'm going to split you into underestimators and overestimators. And I'll have you play games against each other, and afterwards you can win some points that you can redeem for money. And what happens? The underestimators start to discriminate against the overestimators. And the overestimators start to discriminate against the underestimators. So Teifel failed. He failed to create a group that's so silly that its members don't favor those who are part of it against everybody else. But he learned something incredibly important, which is how easily we form those kinds of groups. By the way, I teach at Johns Hopkins, which is now an incredibly diverse campus. In the incoming class, only about 20% of the students are white, so we have students from all over, from every country, from every ethnic and religious group within the United States. And they think of themselves as some of the most tolerant people in the world, and in some ways they are. But I had them debate whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich, and the students who think that a hot dog is a sandwich start to discriminate against those who think that a hot dog is not a sandwich. So this groupishness is everywhere. Now what this shows is some of the dangers that groups can lead to, because this instinct can always be mobilized in order to treat others terribly. But it also shows something about the way in which the context determines what your group is, right? It's not just that you're always going to have conflicts among racial lines, or always going to have conflicts among religious lines, or it's always yesterday's conflict is what tomorrow's conflict has to be. It depends on the kind of circumstances in which you move, right? So the example you ask about is that, in India, which is a thriving, diverse democracy, or at least was until recently, that we have so much to learn from, but that also repeatedly has these horrible instances of what we call communal violence, particularly between Hindus and Muslims, not only. And there's an interesting contrast between two cities in India. The first city in which, again and again, there's these violent pogroms, there's these violent killings, particularly of Muslims, but a little bit both ways. And then in the other city, they managed to keep the peace. And why is that? And there's a great study which suggests that the reason is the difference between bridging and non-bridging social capital. So in one city, the city that manages to keep the peace, there's all kinds of associations, literature clubs and rickshaw puller unions and all kinds of civic associations. And they unite people. Hindus and Muslims are both members of each or most of these kinds of associations. In the other city, that's not the case. There's all kinds of associations, but there's separate Hindu and Muslim unions, separate Hindu and Muslim literature clubs, and so on and so forth. And the moment that tensions are running high, that you have this kind of conflict, in one place people have connections, they trust each other. And if Eboo tells me, hey, there's this rumor going on that my group did this horrible thing, that's not true, I know these kids, they didn't do this. I trust him because we're members of the same association and we have a basis of trust. In the other city, we don't have that basis of trust. We don't know each other. And so I might believe those rumors. And I say, well, they're attacking us, we should attack them. And that's how you get these kinds of horrific outcomes. And so I think one of the really important questions for how to build diverse democracies that work is not to get rid of groups. That's never going to work. You're always going to have groups. That's part of our human nature. But it is to build the connection between members of different groups such that we might say, hey, you're Muslim and I'm Jewish, and that's fine, we can have pride in our own group and so on, but we're also Americans together. We're also members of this association. We also play sports together. We also have some point of connection in which we come to like and trust each other. And I think the work that your organization does is just so powerful in actually shaping that social reality in the United States in a concrete way. And that's precisely what we need, not to overcome the groupishness, which we never will, but to manage it in a productive way where it can inspire cooperation and civic friendship rather than a dangerous way where it can lead, in the worst cases, as in this example in India, to murder and to violence.
So you would talk about civic institutions and social infrastructure, another term I'll throw out there that we both know what it means, but maybe explain it for the audience. And how do you build them, and how do you train the people who run them?
It was striking to read that example in Yascha's book, which I read beginning to end in like 2 days, because it's such a smart book, and it's so well written. It's such a quick read, and we're from India, right? And we're Indian Muslims, and my sister-in-law, my wife's sister, is in Gujarat when it explodes under Modi in the early 2000s, right? And we're thinking to ourselves, wait a second, India is supposed to be. It is supposed to be a place where people from diverse identities and divergent ideologies have civic relationships and political equality. And then it's not, right? These things are fragile. Diverse democracies are, when you achieve the impossible, right? When you achieve the diverse democracy, you have to keep strengthening it. So, Z, to your question, so one of the examples I give in my book is from a front page story in the New York Times 6 or 8 years ago. It opens with this line: when there is a fire in the Muslim part of the city of Mostar, the Croat Catholic Fire Department does not respond. Do you remember this article? I mean, just think about this for a second, right? I'm gonna repeat that line because it's so alien. When there is a fire in the Bosnian Muslim part of the city of Mostar, the Croat Catholic Department does not respond. When there is a fire in the Croat Catholic part, even if the Bosnian Muslim Fire Department happens to be closer, it does not respond. The schools in Mostar, the Catholics go to school from 7:30 to 1:30. The Muslims go to school from 2:30 to 8:30. Croat Catholics go to a nightclub called Art. Bosnian Muslims go to a nightclub called Pink Panther. There are separate garbage collection companies, right? It is a society whose civic and even governmental institutions is entirely organized along the lines of ethnic religious identity. By the way, that is the rule in human history. It's one of the things you'll learn from Yascha's book, right? We're the exception. Diverse democracy is the exception, right? The rule in human history is identity communities build institutions for their own identity community, in part to serve it, in part to grow it, in part to reproduce it, in part to fight the other people, right? So what do you think happens when there's tension, a rumor, whatever, between Croat Catholics and Bosnian Muslims in the city of Mostar? Those fire departments are pretty good places to organize a militia. That's the history of ethnic, religious, civic conflict in nations in which there is diversity but no real integration, right? And Yascha and I spent 3 hours talking about this at Flow, but I think a huge brilliance of diverse democracies is that people, groups, identity groups can start institutions which is an expression of their identity. DePaul University, Vincentian Catholic, Loyola University, Jesuit, right? Northwestern University, Methodist. You can start an institution out of your own identity inspiration. This is what it means to be Methodist or Catholic, and you serve people from all identities. So you have figured out a way to be Methodist or Jewish or Muslim, etc., in a way that is not in tension with identity communities, but you define your identity as people who serve others, right? So I'm in this country, my family's in this country because a university started by French Catholic priests and brothers on the Indiana prairie in 1842, a time of really ugly anti-Catholicism, found fit to admit a somewhat wayward Ismaili Muslim immigrant into their MBA program in the mid-1970s. That man is my father. And I once asked Father Hesburgh, the president of Notre Dame for 35 years, I said, why you're founded as a Catholic university to serve Catholics, number one, theologically, and number two, for economic uplift at a time when other universities were not accepting Catholics, right? I mean, Notre Dame exists in part because other universities wouldn't admit Catholics because of prejudice. And Father Hesburgh says to me, there's two definitions of the word Catholic. There's large C Catholic, which means fidelity to a certain church, right? A particular idea of truth. And there's small c Catholic, which means universal. And our job at Notre Dame is to connect the large C, the commitment to a particular truth and the fidelity to a particular church, to the small c, to the idea of universal thriving, right? That's the secret sauce of America's diverse democracy, and I think it's in danger, right? I think you have to create secret sauce generation after generation. You can't just let it sit, right? You have to keep on making it. And this notion of continuing to build spaces out of our own identity expression that connects to other identities and that is a stake in them thriving, that's what we do well, and we need to continue doing it well.
Yeah, since we're already talking about identity, I think a lot has been said about how America is going to be a majority-minority country, and I think to some people maybe that's welcome. To others, it's cringy when they hear that. And you reject the notion that demography is destiny, right? That your ethnic background or racial makeup is going to define your path here or anywhere, but here in this country. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, it's so weird. We're at a moment in America where Democrats and Republicans, and perhaps more broadly liberals and conservatives, don't agree on anything, right? We can't agree on the most basic things. But there's one really ambitious, large-scale theory and prediction about the future that oddly, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives have all agreed on. Now here's a problem. It is wrong and dangerous. And that to me is this idea that demography is destiny, and that there's a rising demographic majority for Democrats, and even the supposed scientific truth put forward by the United States Census Bureau that America will be majority-minority by about 2045. So let me explain why I think those things. So if you count together all of the people who are non-Hispanic white, and when you project forward who in America by 2045 will have some ancestor who is not non-Hispanic white, then at about 2045, about 2042, 2048, the exact predictions vary a little bit, the country is going to be majority-minority. Right? Point number one. Point number two, since white Americans are more likely to vote for the Republican Party and non-white Americans are more likely to vote for the Democratic Party, that then leads to a political assumption that this kind of demographic transformation is really going to change the country. That's going to move it far to the left, and that Democrats are going to start having a much easier time winning elections. In fact, in 2016, both the New York Times and NPR ran articles saying there's no way that Hillary Clinton will lose because of a demographic change in the country. And actually, empirically, both of this turns out to be far too simplistic, right? So you're talking about Catholics a moment ago. When you look at the voting behavior of Catholics in the United States, particularly Irish Americans in the United States in the 1960s, you would think this is a key voting bloc for Democrats. And if we want to know who's going to have an easier time winning elections in 50 years, we should look at the relative development of the Irish American population as a proportion of the population in 50 years. Well, today Irish Americans are one of the most reliable voting bloc for Republicans. So this can really change over time. In fact, it's changed within the last few years. The main reason why Donald Trump was competitive in the 2020 elections is that he significantly increased his share of the vote among every non-white demographic, among African Americans, among Asian Americans, and particularly among Hispanics. And Joe Biden is the legitimately elected 46th president of the United States, whatever 40% of Americans might say, in large part because he significantly increased his share of the vote among white voters relative to Hillary Clinton in 2016. So we simply cannot predict who's going to be winning elections by running those numbers out into the future. And that is a good thing, because the right is paranoid about this and thinks that everything is going to be lost because of those changes. But actually there's a lot of conservative people in all of those voter groups. And so Republicans, and I'm not normally in the business of giving Republicans electoral advice, can absolutely be competitive by appealing to those conservative non-white voters. And that's a good thing for our society, because I don't want to be able today or in 20 years to look into this audience and to guess who you're voting for based on the color of your skin. And by the way, if that was true, I imagine that some of you would have to vote for a different party from the party you're actually voting for. You probably don't want to do that either. But let's go even one step further. So a bunch of people have been making this point, and I think it's a very important one. But let's go one step further. Does it make sense to describe America today as being easily divided into whites and people of color? Now, I think it's true that everybody who's visibly non-white in this country suffers certain disadvantages that we should take seriously and that we should combat. Some of the people who are classed as white by the Census Bureau suffer those disadvantages, like many Middle Eastern people who somehow count as white. Many people who count as people of color do not suffer those disadvantages, including people from Spain or Portugal who present as white. So there's odd things going on even there, but absolutely there is colorism and there is prejudice against people who have non-white skin. That's something we should take seriously. Nevertheless, the sociological reality of how people think about themselves and how they're treated in society is way more complicated than that. We have a growing number of mixed race Americans. There used to be about 1 in 33 newborns who were mixed race in America. Now it's about 1 in 7. And they have a much more complicated identity than the one-drop rule would suggest. We have Asian Americans whose belonging in the complicated sort of constellations of race in America is often complicated. It's not obvious that in socioeconomic, educational, other terms they're more closely aligned with Hispanics or Asian or African Americans than with white Americans. We have many Hispanics who define themselves strongly as whites rather than as people of color, which makes a lot of sense when you look at the political divisions within Latin American societies, which actually have racial divisions of their own, which are very, very influential and important. When I came from San Francisco a couple of days ago, and when I got into the cab, and I'm sorry to sound like the columnist who talks about the cab driver, I saw a Bolsonaro 2022 cap in the car. And I started talking to my driver, who is Brazilian, who thinks of himself as white, even though he would be classed as a person of color according to the United States Census Bureau, who's a super fan of Bolsonaro, and unsurprisingly, he's a United States citizen, votes for Donald Trump. Right? So it's just the way that people think of themselves is much more complicated. And it's just particularly given the original sin of American society, of slavery, and the particular kind of disadvantage that it bestows on people, and that in the ways in which it has continued to structure the chances of not all, but many people today. It's just very strange to think that somebody who may have French aristocratic family on one side and Indian Brahmin family on the other side, and who has parents who are professionals and who grows up going to a nice school in the suburbs of Chicago, that this person somehow naturally belongs in the same metaphysical category as somebody who grows up in the most deprived parts of South Chicago, who has ancestors, all of whom were brought here in chains and enslaved. That's just a form of magical thinking. It doesn't actually describe our reality in important ways. So I've gotten to the point where in certain contexts it makes sense to talk about whites and people of color, but often now when I see it, I think that's a misdescription of our reality, which actually is really misleading and can be dangerous.
I'm going to slightly pivot us, but we might actually come back to this point with your response.
Yascha and I made a deal over lunch.
Yeah.
That he was going to get into trouble over this time. Next time I'm going to get into trouble over it.
You might still get in trouble.
Right.
So all three of us spend a lot of time on college campuses. And one thing that, I'm deeply troubled by, I'm sure you are as well, is the narrowing of discourse that is happening on campuses, because you cannot freely speak your views sometimes without being canceled. And I think about this problem of cancel culture because I don't think that it's compatible with a diverse democracy. And Yascha, I don't know how old you are, but I know that we're all of kind of a generation X, right? Or a generation that didn't have this in our college experience the same way that exists now. And Eboo, you talk about in your book this whole chapter on your experience at Sarah Lawrence College. And I wonder if you would talk about that, and if you would both kind of speak to how do you cancel culture? How do you think about that? How we're training, the next minds and leaders of our country?
So Doug told me he was going to fire me if I didn't talk about this today on stage. So we had dinner last night, and I'm really glad this is coming. So so I've probably been to 150 campuses for 12 years. My colleague Amber, who's here, senior staff, executive team at Interfaith America. For 10 years, we focus exclusively on college campuses at Interfaith America, and in the past couple of years have been broadening to work with government and private companies and health systems, et cetera. But we had a really tight focus on campuses. I've probably been to 150 campuses. It's probably in 25 campuses a year. So I feel like I have a pretty deep and broad experience. Here's what I would say. Number one, 90% of my interactions have been positive, right? So I don't think campuses as a whole are crazy zone, okay? 90% of my experiences have been positive, and I think American college campuses they're a treasure of our civilization. There's this great book by Andy Delbanco, who's a professor at Columbia. He says, look, if you were to stack any of the kind of great cultural achievements of American civilization, the national parks, jazz, baseball, the Constitution, he says our system of 2,600 residential four-year colleges would easily make the top 5. I think that's remarkable, right? So it is a treasure of our civilization, and anybody who's involved with the campus in any way, you ought to be proud because you're kind of nurturing American civilization that way. I would say 8% of my interactions, I think to myself, this is worrisome. I don't really like this. And 2%, I'm like, I think this is crazy, right? And I don't like framing this as justice versus free speech. I think a campus is a place where you should be able to speak. You should be able to explore multiple explanatory paradigms. I'm going to say it again. Super geeky, I know, but I'm very fond of this phrase, so I'm going to say it again. Right? It is an exploration of multiple explanatory paradigms. And if you only have one explanatory paradigm, and by the way, I was a guy who only had one explanatory paradigm coming out of college, and it was like the world was nails because all I had was a hammer, right? By the way, I think that explanatory paradigm is a valid paradigm, right? So I think a social justice paradigm is a perfectly valid paradigm. It's just not the only one. It's just not the only one. So I will tell you my personal story about this. This isn't in the I do this kind of whole chapter in the about my experience at Sarah Lawrence College in the book, which I think is going to be excerpted in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book. So if people pick it up, I hope you read it. But here's a different story which I think illustrates this. So I get a deep kind of inculcation in social justice thinking, a legit intellectual and moral paradigm when I was at the University of Illinois in the mid-1990s, which incidentally is an era that feels a lot like now, right? Like Bell Hooks is like the Ibram X. Kendi of that moment, a really important thinker. I'm really glad I spent that much time with that, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Cornel West, et cetera. So I go to England and I am starting a PhD research on ethnography of a group of South Asians. And I'm, doing what ethnographers do. I'm interviewing people, and I'm doing participant observation, and I'm continuing to try to get them to talk about the racism they've experienced, right? And it's not computing for them. And I'm trying a dozen different ways from Sunday because so much of my life in college, the social justice paradigm had illuminated around race. Super helpful to me, super illuminating about the world. I'm trying to do this in England with this group of South Asians. And after 6 months of doing this, I sit down with my with my PhD advisor, and I'm pulling my hair out, and I'm like, I'm a terrible ethnographer because I basically can't fit my data, this group of South Asians, into my theory. And my PhD advisor was like, maybe you should try a different theory. Maybe you should and by the way, it's not really good ethnography, nor is it like being nice to tell other people who you think they are. The job of the scholar, of the intellectual, is to look at the world and to develop theories that explain the things that are happening in the world. You get to have a hypothesis theory coming in, and if it doesn't work, right? If the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, if the data doesn't match, you need other theories. Now, by the way, this isn't all South Asians in England, right? There's probably plenty of them who principally do understand themselves in a racial justice paradigm. But the particular group that I was with didn't. And my job is to have an explanatory paradigm that illuminates their experience as they're telling it to me. That's the academic field of ethnography. But I only had one paradigm, right? I think this is the problem. That if you only have one paradigm, you can't, then you're only putting the world together one way all the time. I'll just very quickly. I'll just David Brooks has this great story in the Second Mountain. I think this is like the quintessential reflection on the college experience. He says that the University of Chicago made him read Edmund Burke in college, and he hated it. Right, this European kind of traditionalist. He hated it, like this notion of maintain traditions and like consider the good of a social order that has lasted for generations and consider custom and et cetera, right? Think about, he couldn't stand it, right? He would like do debates against Edmund Burke. He'd write papers and screeds against Edmund Burke. And then David Brooks' first couple jobs is as a journalist. And part of what he covers is what is happening to public housing in Chicago. And none of the paradigms that he favored in college explain the situation. And he's like, in his book, The Second Mountain, he's like, almost like a secret, I went back to Edmund Burke and I found an explanatory paradigm for that situation, right? And he's like, I'm really glad that somebody forced me to read it. Right? So that, I think, is what college is about. It's about exploring multiple explanatory paradigms. It's also about being able to share half-formed thoughts without fear, right? Again, 90% of my life, 90% of my time on campuses, I'm like, we ought to be really proud of this as Americans. 8%, I'm like, I'd shift a little bit here. 2%, I'm like, we have gone over the edge.
Yeah. Van Jones came and spoke at the Institute of Politics a few years ago, and he likened the university to like a boxing gym, right? Which is where you do the workout to work on your ideas. And I think that's what you're saying, Eboo. It's like you can't just talk to the people you agree with and read the things that you agree with and then expect to be competitive on those ideas in the broader world, because I think college is a little bit of an insular place. And so do you have thoughts about cancel culture, or we can move on?
Oh God, I do, but I'll try to keep them brief, but I do have thoughts. Well, first of all, just Eboo shared with me an excerpt of his book that's going to come out. I'm not going to say in which newspaper because people are nervous about jinxing it, but a big national newspaper based in New York City. And it's really a beautiful piece of writing which tells in a narrative way how he got drawn into this one paradigm and how it did illuminate things for him, but also how he started to understand that when your primary instinct is to tear things down rather than to build, it can make you callous and it can mislead you. It's a beautiful piece. I'm sure you all are subscribed, so you'll see it on Tuesday or somewhere.
If they don't
like
run
that.
it, I'm blaming you.
There you are.
You totally jinxed it.
I didn't jinx it. I agree, by the way, with the 82% kind of breakdown. I mean, my students are really smart, really thoughtful people who are trying to grapple with the world and what they think about it. And I agree with them on some things, I disagree with them on other things, but by and large, we are able to deal with difficult subjects in a respectful way. And every time that I thought, should I assign this piece of reading? Should I discuss this in the classroom? This could really go wrong. Nearly every time I have a very positive experience because the students are hungry to debate these ideas. But my formative experience in college was sitting around until late at night with my friends debating about the world. And we would explore ideas and play with ideas, but with a serious purpose, right? We wanted to make the world a better place, and we wanted to figure out what we think about the world, but we also had this freedom of being able to try positions on and to argue through things and so on without fear, without apprehension. When I ask my students whether they're able to do that today, most of them say no. Most of them say, perhaps with my best friend behind closed doors, but not in the dining hall. And that is just so sad to me, because these students want better and they deserve better, but they have rational reason to be afraid. And that just means that we're failing as institutions to provide them with the things that we on this stage, I think, got from college. And so that's really sad. So that's one important point. The second important point is that, quote unquote, cancel culture is not about the people who are going to be cancelled. I mean, I know people who've been cancelled on crazy grounds, and it is not nice, and it is an injustice. But it's not ultimately about that. It is about the ideas that get lost when we don't know where the line is and we don't even want to have uncomfortable conversations in public. And it's about mistrust in elites. One thing we were talking about over lunch, and neither of us was saying anything crazy or radical, is, in this moment, and I think we're both pushing ourselves in this conversation to be as open as possible, in part because we're talking about this, it's so easy to say the things that you're grappling with in private but not in public, because you don't want to go anywhere close to a position that might get you in trouble in public. And you know what? People notice. They know when you talk to them honestly and when you don't talk to them honestly. And if, to show my partisan colors, we want to make sure that we beat Donald Trump in 2024, and similar people like that, talking honestly about the world is a really important part of it, because I get why many Americans say, I really don't like Trump and I don't know that I trust him, but you know what? I don't trust these other guys either, because I don't have a sense that they actually level with me. I don't have a sense that they talk about the world in an honest way. Why should I trust them? That's a really, really dangerous place to be at, because it makes it easier for really dangerous people like Donald Trump to win political power.
Thank you three very much for the discussion. If you want to share some final thoughts, we're going to move on to the Q&A.
Okay, so I do have a framing for the final thoughts, which is, we have this melting pot metaphor, which is actually pretty terrible if you think about it. And I think each of you in your book kind of outline a different metaphor that you see a diverse democracy, and maybe in particular the United States. So can you maybe have closing thoughts on that? And then also, I think what we didn't touch on, I would have loved to, is the narrative piece of this. How do we all fit in? What is the narrative in which we all fit in? Because patriotism to me seems maybe lacking for some folks, but if we're going to have a common bond, we all have to feel part of a common project. So, Eboo, if you want to go first.
So Yascha actually in his book does a great job describing the melting pot metaphor and the history of it and the play it comes from. And part of it, what I think I learned from that is it was a step forward for the time, right? And what I mean, what can you do but take a step forward from where you're at, right? Like should you measure America by its distance from heaven or by its progress from its past? What are you going to do? Right? Like, take a step forward for your time. So Melting Pot was a step forward. Read Yascha's book to find out what that step was. But I disliked it less after reading that section. Right? I think the step forward. I think the due date has passed on Melting Pot. And I think I like Yascha's metaphor, which he'll tell you about. But my metaphor is potluck nation. We're a potluck nation. And what does a potluck depend on? A potluck depends on a diverse group of people bringing their dishes to the table. You want people's contributions, right? And if everybody, with apologies to my friend Phil, is a Minnesota Lutheran, you need a lot of casseroles. Hot dish is what you call it, right? And as much as I like biryani, you don't want a bunch of Hyderabadis there only to bring biryani. You want a mix of people bringing a mix of dishes.
I'll take the biryani over whatever the other dish is.
You want a mix of people bringing a mix of dishes. Why is bigotry and racism bad? Because it's a violation of those people's personal dignity, but it's also a barrier to the contribution. You don't get to taste their dish, right? So when you get those dishes together, you have creative combinations. You have people being generally respectful. People will label dishes, that have pork in it, label dishes that have dairy in it, etc. People will kind of hang out with people that they're comfortable with. They'll meet some new people, but nobody ever says that person shouldn't come to the potluck. It's kind of a come y'all type thing. And the thing that I love the most about a potluck, and this is kind of consistent with the theme of my whole book, is no general, no mayor, no president commands people to potluck. We do it on our own. It's the ultimate civic form. And you could think of a million ways it goes off the rails, but it almost never does. It's almost always magic, right? And I just think that's the most wonderful thing. And to think of ourselves as a potluck nation, a nation that welcomes the diverse contributions to the table, that nurtures relationship, and that is a commitment to the common good, right? You have to have a safe place to eat, you have to have clean utensils, and everybody has a responsibility to that.
Yascha.
Yeah, so it's interesting that we really have come up with metaphors, but different metaphors, but really trying to get at exactly the same thing. So the way that I sort of try to describe it in the book is that there's this metaphor of the melting pot, which asks too much homogeneity. So it both is unrealistic in terms of its expectations for the extent to which people will shed the cultural particularities. And that's a shame, because one of the wonderful things about America is that you have people continuing to celebrate the cultures from which they originate, and that everything does not end up being one kind of thing. I mean, the melting pot doesn't sound like it's going to taste very good, does it? Now, I think there's also a mistake if we go to the opposite, which is the salad bowl or the mosaic, and that sort of has this vision of, we're going to have all these communities, but they really just live next to each other, right? And there's no connective tissue between them. We're just a sort of group of groups or an association of associations. And there you are, and it's a little bit how you were describing Mostar. It's how today in Lebanon you might describe the society, right? You're born into this group, well, you better stick with it, because there's not an easy way of connecting with others, and when you try to, the society tells you off, because that's not how things work here, right? That's not an appealing vision of society either. And so I suggest a public park, because the way I think about a public park is that if all of us want to continue this conversation after this great conversation, we can go to a park somewhere close by and say, we really don't want to stay among ourselves and just, keep talking about this topic, right? Or we might meet people who are sitting next to us and say, hey, we had a great time talking, but now let's also meet other people and get in conversation with perhaps audience members or random people who are sitting there, whoever else, and we build this new connective tissue. Now, in America, in a free society, you can make either choice. Both are legitimate choices, right? You can say you're born into a particular kind of cultural or religious community, and that's really important to you, and nearly all of your friends and acquaintances are going to be in that group, and you spend all of your time volunteering within that group, and that's perfectly legitimate. But as a society, we also want to make sure that some people don't make that choice. That some people make the choice of doing interfaith work. That some people make the choice of leaving the group they come from, doing something completely different. That some people build all of that kind of connective tissue and have a freedom to do that. And so we can have an aesthetic judgment about what kind of public park we're creating. And I'm sure that if we think about this more, we find some ways of merging these two metaphors.
Well,
so
we would have a
it's
potluck
in
at the park, obviously, on the lake. And with that, we can go to audience questions.
We have a few minutes for questions, everybody. If you'll raise your hand if you have one. Awesome. Coming to you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, so we agree with the problems at college campus. I have two millennials, and having spent a fair amount of time, I agree with you. Our colleges have been the greatest experiment ever. And I think they've been a big melting pot. I think and they are the people who are, like you rightly said, intermarrying, I mean, if you look at Asian data, Hispanic data, the amount of people intermarrying, especially those who are educated, is enormous. I think our problem really stems from people who are not going to college. They tend to be far more segregated. And therefore, I think that is our issue. And I think that is one point you both did not address. How do we get people who do not have a chance to intermingle with other people, get to understand each other's cultures? I'll tell you my own experience from India. I mean, probably Mr. Patel can agree that, like, as Indians, we have always visited each other's religious places. We celebrate each other's religious traditions. You know, I'm a Sikh. I'm just 1% of the population. I've been to every Hindu temple there is, every Christian, place, and we all go to each other's places and we celebrate, whether it's Christmas, whether it's Eid. But that happens far less here. And I understand the problems that India is facing now, and they're terrible. I just came back from India with growth of nationalism in India and these Hindu-Muslim problems that are new. But I think we should address, the campus problem is one, but the other problem, how do we get the vast majority of people interacting with each other?
Right, so we did talk about racial diversity and religious diversity, but we did not talk about kind of this division between maybe those of us who go to college, have gone to college, and those from other communities, more rural communities or not. So, but I know you both have written about it in your books.
Yeah, so I would describe the situation a little bit different, and I'd love to hear, perhaps afterwards we can talk a little bit about the data, because what you're saying is interesting, that for example, there's much more interracial marriage among more educated people than less educated people. I wonder whether that's in part because it co-varies with how long people have been in the country, right? So it tends to be the case that first-generation immigrants are, less affluent, less educated, speak English less well, and then they're also more likely to stay within their communities. As their children, their grandchildren experience socioeconomic mobility, they integrate into society, and then they're also much more likely to intermarry. So it's not clear to me that when you would compare a third or fourth generation Hispanic or Asian American at the same socioeconomic level, whether they would be less likely to intermarry if they're working class than if they're affluent. That may be the case, but my hunch is that it's not the case. I know that in many places there is actually really a growing intertwining of different communities at the working class level as well, and it's one of the things that I find very inspiring about the changes of the last decades. Now, and by the way, in general, the success of immigrants is tremendous. This is just a point where there's so much pessimism from the far right that says today's immigrants are somehow inferior to Irish and Italian and Greek immigrants in this neighborhood 100 years ago. And that's obviously completely wrong. But there's also a lot of pessimism among my friends and colleagues who say, well, look, yes, all of these immigrants today from El Salvador and Vietnam and Kenya, they're not succeeding, not because there's something wrong with them, but there's something wrong with us, because the society is so discriminatory and so racist that we don't stand a chance. Now, they do experience discrimination and racism without a doubt, but the best studies suggest that they are integrating at the same speed as Italians and Irish did 100 years ago. It's a somewhat slow process, but there's very real socioeconomic and educational progress, and we should be able to celebrate that. Now, what I worry about with the class division is a little bit different. It's the fact that I'm an immigrant to this country, but one that obviously was relatively privileged, who came here for graduate school. And my socioeconomic, my friendship circle, my circle of acquaintances and friends is pretty religiously and ethnically diverse. Perhaps not as diverse as it might be, but it's really very diverse in those terms. I barely know anybody in this country who didn't go to college. I barely know anybody who didn't go to an elite college. I barely know anybody who didn't go to grad school. And I'm sometimes shocked by the way in which people in my circles look down at the rest of society, feel better than other citizens, feel like we are enlightened and tolerant and so on, and the average American is really a terrible person. And that I find really concerning for our civic health. And I don't know what to do about it, but it's something that we should think hard about.
Do you want to respond or move on?
Yeah, Yascha and I talked about this over lunch. Like, I think that it is the least talked about, hardest problem to solve outside of, honestly, climate change, right? I think the hardest problem to solve is the problem of what happens to people without college education, which, by the way, is 2/3 of the country. So let me ask, just think about this, right? How many of you in the last week or 2 or 3 have been offended by a sign that says college degree required or college degree preferred? Okay, so does that mean you didn't see one of those signs, or you're just not offended by it because you have a college degree, right? So by the way, 2/3 of America, 2/3 of the country does not have a college degree. Imagine being them. Imagine walking through the world and just casually seeing signs, college degree required or college degree preferred. Who's writing those job ads? We are. Who are we just casually and flagrantly insulting all the time? Right? I mean, like, to the point where we don't even think about it. So, like, my kind of scales falling from my eyes moment was this 2014, 2015, and I, back then I used to read the New York Times in paper. So I'm taking it out of its blue wrapping, open up, see the cover, and the above the fold story is deaths of the mortality rate for rural white Americans has increased for the first time in recent history, shocking economists. And I'm like, wait, what? Right? And by the way, like, that doesn't just happen. Like, that's like not like a last year thing, right? That's like a 30-year trend. And I'm reading this story and I'm like, this is the first time I've thought of this. It is the first time I have thought about what happens to people who don't have college degrees and live outside of cities. That's like dereliction of duty as a citizen, right? And I think that that's a really hard problem to solve. And part of the reason, honestly, guys like us don't talk a lot about it, because I don't have a solution for it. Do you? I like to write books with things I have ideas about, I don't have a solution for this.
Let's get other questions.
Yeah.
We have a few more minutes.
Thank you so much for that question. We're actually only going to be able to take one more question tonight.
Hi, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on how does one define the common good, and how do we come to a common understanding of the common good? Because a lot of what you said, both of you, really depends on us having a shared vision of both who we are and who we think we want to be. And when we don't have that shared vision, it's really hard to see how all of this good stuff you're talking about comes about.
Yeah, so I appreciate that question. So I actually am not sure I agree with the premise, and I look forward to talking about it more. But I think so. My best line in 10 years: diversity is not just the differences you like. Right? Diversity is not just the differences you like. So the big question is not how Yascha and I get along, right? So Yascha is a Jew from Polish ancestry from Germany, elite educated. I'm an Ismaili Muslim, heritage from India, elite educated. We have a lot of different identities, very similar views, right? The question is, how do I get along with somebody who I really dislike? Let's draw the line at the KKK. I'm not buying a brownie from the KKK bake sale. But the question of a diverse democracy is, how do you get along with people you dislike? And I don't think the answer there is a common vision of the common good within certain basic parameters. I think the answer there is, are there enough civic spaces that bring people from diverse identities and divergent ideologies together in common activities? So it's not a common good, it's common activities. It's athletic leagues, it's volunteer fire departments, it's food banks, it's Habitat for Humanity builds, it's healthcare settings. It's the place where you're like, people here voted differently. People here believe in God in different ways. People here have very different ideologies, and watch them save a life together. Watch them save a life together, right? And I think that that's the secret of America, because the only other alternative is getting people to think and believe the same things you do. And I just don't think that's diversity, right? Again, there are principles and parameters. Everybody should be able to vote, right? There are principles and parameters, but I don't want, if I call an ambulance, right, for an emergency situation, and those EMTs on the way learn that they voted differently and they can't work together, and the ambulance doesn't come, that's a problem. That's a problem, right? And I think the genius of America is people who vote differently save lives together. They volunteer together. They play ball together. And that's what I'm most interested in strengthening.
Yeah, that's a tough act to follow. But I think it's exactly right that America is premised on the idea that we'll never agree. And this is the genius of Federalist Number 10, my absolutely favorite document in American political history, right? So let's think back to a moment, because we're so much the product of the framers and that particular essay, but it's hard to understand how counterintuitive it was, right? So there they are at the end of the 18th century saying, we want to found a self-governing republic. And by the way, every attempt in the history of the world to do this has gone badly wrong. And what has gone wrong? Factions have been so at war with each other that it just all fell apart. So what's the natural solution? We're doing something that everybody before us has tried to do, and every time the problem has been these factions going at each other. What's the natural solution? Get rid of faction, suppress faction. That's what anybody would think. That's not what they say. They say, no. We're going to multiply factions. Because when there's two factions or three factions, that's really dangerous, because one might hope to dominate all the other factions, to lord it over all of the other factions, right? But if we actually multiply the factions, and nobody can ever quite hope to be in the majority, then we have to agree on these common standards and parameters that mean that we all know we're going to be safe. We all know we're going to be fine. And I might hate your ideas, but you know what? If you win the election, I know in 4 years I'll have a chance to persuade everybody, and perhaps I'll be in power at that time. And so what we need is to make sure that we don't fall apart into these two warring tribes, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, or whites versus people of color, or Christians versus non-Christians, or whatever it may be. We cannot allow America to dissolve into these two super factions that face each other with that kind of anger. We need to make sure that we uphold the basic rules of a liberal democracy, which makes sure that we all have a freedom to engage in our forms of worship, to express ourselves freely without having to worry about being locked up or having a mob of people at our doorstep because they don't like who we are or what we do. But also to go out and make new connections, to live our lives as we want. But most importantly, we need the vision of a society that most people from different groups actually would want to live in, in which they say, I won't like everything, I won't agree with my neighbor necessarily, but I'll have a place where I feel respected, and I will be a member of this country who finds something in it to love. And what I love in this country might be a little bit different from what my neighbor loves in this country, but we all feel safe and respected, and we'll all find something to love in this place that is ours. And I just want to say, this event is not America, and this panel is not America. But the fact that we can sustain this event and we can sustain this panel in our country means a lot. The fact that we all come from different kinds of identities, and I think the way we speak about this topic is informed in each of our cases by our own identities. Yep. But we can also really commune in how we think about the challenges our country faces and come to, a set of shared hopes and sentiments about that. That's really powerful, and it makes me go home so much more optimistic today than I arrived.
Thank you, Yascha. Please join me in thanking Yascha and Eboo. I hope you'll buy their book. Thank you all for being here, and see you soon.